What if the one thing you thought made you invisible was actually your greatest power? What if the world, in all its noise and judgment, had simply failed to see the treasure you were hiding in plain sight? We walk past people every day, assigning them value based on the uniform they wear or the station they hold, never once imagining the universe of knowledge they might carry within them. This is a story about one such person. A story about a woman who was seen as nothing, and the man who was forced to see everything. It begins, as so many forgotten stories do, under the tired, flickering light of a place no one of importance ever meant to be. Elara traced the rim of a coffee cup with a damp cloth, the motion so practiced it was part of her breathing. For 5 years, her world had been the scent of burnt coffee, the sticky residue on cheap Formica tables, and the relentless hum of the greasy spoon diner's failing refrigerator. Her uniform, a faded polyester blue, was a second skin, a cloak of invisibility she wore for 10 hours a day. Each night, she would return to her tiny apartment, the one where the ghost of her mother's last days still lingered in the unpaid medical bills stacked high on the kitchen counter. That pile of paper was a monument to her failure, a constant, silent accusation. Her own dreams, the ones filled with ancient texts and forgotten languages she'd once shared with her historian father, were buried under the weight of that debt. He had taught her that language was the soul of a culture, a living map of human history. After he passed, and her mother fell ill, those books became her only solace, a secret world she would retreat to when the real one became too much to bear. She wasn't just a waitress, she was a keeper of dead tongues, a silent scholar of the unspoken. But in the diner, she was just the girl who refilled your coffee, her face as forgettable as the day's special. Her shoes were worn through at the soles, a quiet testament to the miles she walked between tables, her own life on pause while she served others. The world saw a servant, and so a servant she had become. She had forgotten the fire of her own intellect, the sharp, brilliant mind that could navigate the complexities of civilizations long turned to dust. She was simply Elara, the waitress. And in her world, that was all anyone, including herself, expected her to be. He was a man carved from ice and ambition. Julian Thorne did not belong in a place like the Greasy Spoon Diner. His suit, a tailored masterpiece of dark charcoal wool, seemed to absorb the dim light of the room, making him a void of power and wealth in a sea of mediocrity. He was the CEO of Thorne Industries, a global titan of finance and technology, a man whose name was a headline, whose decisions moved markets. They called him the Ice King in the glossy pages of business magazines, a moniker earned through a series of ruthless but brilliant acquisitions that had built his father's respectable company into an empire. But empires are heavy, and his legacy was a crown he wore with a permanent, weary tension in his jaw. He was here, in this forgotten corner of the city, because the 5-star hotel restaurant where he was meant to be closing the deal of his career had suffered a sudden kitchen fire. A ridiculous, mundane inconvenience that had forced him and his chief legal counsel, David Chin, into this absurdly common establishment. David, ever the pragmatist, was trying to make the best of it, his laptop balanced precariously on the wobbly table. "The connection is spotty, Julian," David said, his voice low. "And Marcus is already getting impatient." Julian's gaze was fixed out the window, at the rain-streaked street, his expression unreadable. "Let him be impatient," he replied, his voice a low baritone that cut through the diner's clatter. "Impatience is a tell." On the table between them lay the source of his current frustration, a thick, leather-bound contract. The prize was a partnership with a reclusive, old-world conglomerate that would secure Thorne Industries' dominance for the next half-century. But there was a catch. The family patriarch, a man steeped in tradition, had insisted the final clauses be written in his native tongue, a dialect of ancient Aramaic, a language so obscure that Julian's entire fleet of high-paid corporate linguists had been left staring blankly at the page. They could translate the words, but they couldn't grasp the intent, the poetry, the centuries of cultural nuance woven into the legal framework. It was a test, and Julian knew he was failing it. He was a man who controlled everything, yet here he was, stalled by a ghost of a language in a Greasy Spoon Diner, the biggest deal of his life hanging by a thread of ink he couldn't decipher. The speakerphone on the table crackled to life, and the smug, condescending voice of Marcus Vance filled the small booth. Still staring at your hieroglyphics, Julian? Marcus was a senior board member, a creature of the old guard who had resented Julian's ascent from the moment it began. He saw Julian's modern, aggressive style as a betrayal of his father's more conservative legacy, and had been looking for an opportunity to undermine him for years. Perhaps you should have invested in a Rosetta Stone subscription instead of another skyscraper. David shot Julian a look, a mix of apology and warning. Julian's expression didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. We're handling it, Marcus, are you? Marcus's laugh was like grinding glass. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're about to lose the Nakamoto deal because you couldn't be bothered to do your homework. Your father would be so proud. The barb hit its mark. The mention of his father was a deliberate cruelty. Elara was approaching their table, a steaming coffee pot in her hand, her movements silent and practiced. She moved through the world on quiet feet, trained to be unheard and unseen. But she heard. She heard the desperation masked by Julian's icy calm, the lawyer's quiet anxiety, and the venom dripping from the speakerphone. Her eyes fell on the document on the table. The script wasn't just script. It was music. It was the familiar, beautiful, intricate dance of letters she had spent countless nights tracing with her fingertips in the worn pages of her father's books. It was classical Aramaic, with a regional Syriac influence. A language she knew as well as her own name. A language she hadn't spoken or read for anyone but herself in years. It was her secret, her sanctuary. A wave of fear and an inexplicable surge of courage washed over her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. To speak would be to shatter her invisibility. To remain silent would be to watch this powerful, cold man be defeated by something she understood intimately. She hesitated, the coffee pot trembling slightly in her hand. The aroma of dark roast filled the air, a stark contrast to the ancient, dusty world the script evoked in her mind. She took a half step back, her training screaming at her to retreat, to disappear, to simply ask, "More coffee?" But then she looked at Julian Thorne's face, at the flicker of vulnerability in his steel-gray eyes, and a different instinct took over. She cleared her throat, the sound barely a whisper. "Excuse me." Both men looked up, their expressions shifting from intense concentration to mild annoyance at the interruption. Julian's gaze was dismissive, already categorizing her as part of the background noise. David offered a tight, polite smile, ready to wave her away. "We're fine, thank you," David said, his tone final. But Elara didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the ancient text. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of confidence. "But I can read that." A beat of stunned silence. From the speakerphone, Marcus Vance's voice erupted in a bark of derisive laughter. "Is this a joke? Julian, are you that desperate? You're taking translation advice from the waitress?" The mockery was sharp, public. Julian's eyes narrowed, a flicker of humiliation crossing his face before being replaced by his usual icy mask. He looked at Elara, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw the faded uniform, the hint of exhaustion in her eyes, but also an unexpected spark of defiance. A quiet, stubborn certainty. Most people withered under his scrutiny. She met his gaze directly. Intrigued, and perhaps a little reckless, he decided to call the bluff. "You can't read that," he said, the words a flat, dismissive challenge. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. He slowly, deliberately, slid the heavy contract across the table toward her. The buttery leather whispered against the formica. It was a dare. A test meant to put her back in her place. David shifted uncomfortably. "Julian, what are you doing?" Elara's hand, callous from work but surprisingly steady, reached out and rested on the cover. She took a deep breath, the scent of old paper and ink a grounding force. She opened the document to the contested clauses. For a moment she just looked, her mind connecting the shapes to sounds, the sounds to meaning, the meaning to a history 1,000 miles and 1,000 years away. Then she began to speak. Her voice, soft at first, grew stronger as she translated. She didn't just read the words, she inhabited them. It says, "The branch that grows from the ancient tree shall honor the soil from which it springs." It's a reciprocity clause, but it's phrased as a statement of familial honor, not a legal obligation. They're testing your integrity, not your legal team. They want to know if you see this as a partnership of equals, or if you see them as a resource to be exploited. She looked up. The diner, the clatter of plates, the hum of the refrigerator, it all faded away. There was only the table, the two stunned men, and the dead silence from the speakerphone. She had not only translated the language, she had translated the soul of the deal. Julian Thorne stared at Alara, the entire world reorienting itself around this quiet woman in a cheap blue uniform. The air in the booth was thick with her words, with the profound understanding she had just unlocked. He reached over and ended the call with Marcus without a word, the abrupt click severing the link to his world of cynical corporate warfare. All that mattered was here, in this booth. David Chin was speechless, his pen frozen above his legal pad. He looked from the ancient script to Alara and back again, his logical, ordered mind struggling to process what had just happened. "How?" David began, but Julian raised a hand, silencing him. Julian's eyes, those cold gray instruments of assessment, were now filled with an intense, burning curiosity. He was a man who collected rare assets, who understood value where others saw none. And he had just stumbled upon the most valuable, rarest asset of his life. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice softer than before, stripped of its usual authority, and replaced with genuine inquiry. "Alara," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, the adrenaline beginning to recede, leaving her feeling exposed. "Alara," he repeated, testing the sound of it. He leaned forward, his entire being focused on her. "I will give you $50,000 to finish translating this document. Right here. Right now." Alara's mind reeled. $50,000. It was a number so large it felt unreal. It was freedom from the crushing weight of the bills on her counter. It was a lifeline. But before she could even process the offer, he made another. "No," he said, correcting himself. "That's not enough. This isn't just about translation." He looked at the document, then back at her. "They're testing me. I need more than a translator. I need a guide. I need you." He stood up, the cramped booth suddenly feeling like a stage. "I will give you $250,000. But you don't just finish this here. You come with me. To Zurich. The final negotiation is in 2 days. I need you in that room." David finally found his voice. "Julian, this is insane," he hissed, grabbing his arm. "We can't just pick up a waitress and take her to Zurich. We don't know anything about her. The board will have a fit. Marcus will crucify you." Julian shook off his lawyer's hand, his gaze never leaving Alara. He saw the doubt and fear warring with a flicker of hope in her eyes. "This is my company, David. My legacy. My decision." He turned his full attention back to Alara. $250,000. All expenses paid. You helped me navigate this deal. What do you say? Alara looked at his outstretched hand. It was a bridge to a world she couldn't imagine, offered by a man she didn't know. But then she thought of the bills, of her mother's tired face, of the years spent in the shadows. This was more than money. It was a chance. A chance to be seen. "I'll do it," she said, her voice clear and firm. She put her small, calloused hand into his. The transition was dizzying, a violent collision of worlds. One moment, Alara was handing her grease-stained apron to her shocked manager, the next she was stepping onto the gleaming air stair of a Gulfstream G650. The scent of worn vinyl and stale coffee was replaced by the smell of rich leather and ozonic, recycled air. The threadbare coat she had worn for 3 winters was taken by a silent attendant and replaced with a cashmere blanket. Julian had been ruthlessly efficient. A single phone call had arranged for a courier to pay off the entirety of her mother's medical debt. Another had dispatched a personal shopper to meet them at a private terminal, where an entire wardrobe of exquisitely tailored suits, silk blouses, and elegant dresses awaited her. As she sank into the plush cream-colored seat of the private jet, she looked down at her hands, half expecting to see them covered in grime, but they were clean. Everything was clean. She felt like an imposter, a child playing dress-up in clothes that cost more than she made in a year. Julian sat across from her, engrossed in his work, his laptop casting a cool blue light on his focused features. He hadn't said much since his explosive offer, his demeanor reverting to its cool, professional default. But every now and then, she would catch him looking at her, his expression a complex mixture of calculation and something else she couldn't quite name. It was a look that made her feel less like a person and more like a rare, beautiful, and potentially volatile artifact he had just acquired. Meanwhile, miles away, Marcus Vance was seething. Humiliated and cut off, he had immediately put his own resources to work. He saw Alara not as a secret weapon, but as a grifter, a charlatan who had somehow managed to fool Julian. "Find out who she is," he snarled at his assistant over the phone. "I want to know everything. Where she went to school, where she grew up, every job she's ever had, every person she's ever known. I want to know what parking tickets she has. Dig. She's a nobody from a greasy spoon diner. There's dirt there. There has to be. Julian has staked his reputation on a waitress. I'm going to make sure he pays for it." Marcus paced his opulent office, the city lights glittering below him like a conquered territory. He saw this not just as a business challenge, but as a personal war. Julian's impulsive, unorthodox move was a weakness, and Marcus was a predator who knew how to exploit weakness. He would expose this waitress as a fraud, humiliate Julian in front of the board and their new partners, and seize the control he felt he so rightfully deserved. Alara, flying 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, was oblivious to the storm gathering below. She was simply trying to breathe, trying to reconcile the woman she had been that morning with the woman sitting in a private jet, hurtling toward a future that was as terrifying as it was tantalizing. The boardroom in Zurich was a cathedral of modern power. A vast, polished mahogany table reflected the panoramic view of the snow-dusted Alps. Seated around it were the titans of the Nakamoto conglomerate, a council of stern, dark-suited men led by a patriarch whose eyes held the wisdom and cunning of 1,000 years of trade. On the other side sat Julian's team, looking tense and out of their depth. And in the middle of them, an anomaly in a simple but elegant navy dress, was Alara. She felt the weight of their collective gaze, the silent questioning. To them, she was an unknown variable, an unexplained presence at Julian's side. Marcus Vance was there, having flown in commercially, his presence a dark cloud in the room. He sat at the far end of the table, a smug, predatory smile playing on his lips, waiting. He was certain she would fail. The moment of truth arrived. Mr. Nakamoto, the patriarch, gestured to the contract, and his lead negotiator began to speak in the formal, archaic Aramaic. He pointed to a specific clause, his words flowing in a complex, poetic rhythm. Julian's team looked to their own translator, a nervous man from a top firm, who stammered, He's invoking the breath of the mountain clause. It seems to imply a penalty for unforeseen market shifts payable by us." A murmur of concern went through Julian's side. David shot Alara a desperate look. Julian, however, remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Alara. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. This was her stage. Alara took a breath, the silence in the room amplifying the beat of her own heart. "That is not what it means," she said, her voice calm and clear. She addressed Mr. Nakamoto's negotiator directly, in his own tongue. The man's eyes widened in surprise. The entire room went still. "The breath of the mountain," Alara continued, switching back to English for Julian's team, "is not a penalty. It's a metaphor for shared risk. It's tied to this other clause here." She pointed to a different part of the text. "The river that feeds two valleys. It means that in the face of an unforeseen event, both parties must come together to find a new path forward, sharing the burden equally. It's a test of partnership. They are trying to see if you will argue a penalty or embrace a collaboration." She then found another line, one her own team had completely missed. Furthermore, she said, her confidence growing, the river clause has a reciprocal element. It states that the partner who demonstrates greater foresight in preparing for such shifts is to be granted a 2% controlling interest from the other's initial stake. You've just spent the last quarter diversifying into renewable energy, a market they haven't touched. That is foresight. A gasp went through the room. She hadn't just defused a trap, she had turned it into a weapon. She had used their own test of honor to secure a tangible advantage for Thorn Industries. Marcus Vance's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. Julian looked at Alara, and for the first time, the ice in his eyes melted completely, replaced by a raw, profound respect that was dangerously close to awe. He saw her not as an asset, but as a brilliant, powerful force. The quiet tension that had been simmering between them since the diner ignited into something new, something deeper. A partnership of minds was becoming a connection of souls. The deal was on the verge of being signed, more favorable to Thorn Industries than Julian had ever dreamed possible. The atmosphere was celebratory. Mr. Nakamoto had personally praised Alara's luminous understanding, treating her not as an employee of Julian's, but as an honored peer. It was in this moment of triumph that Marcus Vance chose to strike. "A moment, please," he said, his voice slicing through the room. He stood, a thick dossier in his hand, his face a mask of false concern. "Before we finalize this historic agreement, there is something you all must know." Something about Ms. Alara. He let the name hang in the air. While her performance has been remarkable, I have a duty to the board and to our new partners to ensure this deal is built on a foundation of truth, not deceit. He opened the folder with a dramatic flourish. "This woman is a fraud." He projected documents onto the large screen behind him. Alara's face appeared, a grainy photo from her diner ID badge. Next to it, records of her employment, her address in a low-income building, and her academic record, 2 semesters at a community college before she dropped out to care for her ailing mother. "She is no certified linguist," Marcus announced, his voice booming with righteous indignation. "She has no degree, no formal training from any accredited institution. She is a waitress. A clever, manipulative con artist who has preyed on Mr. Thorne's desperation." He then brought in his final weapon, a prim, severe-looking man he introduced as Dr. Alastair Finch, a world-renowned, Oxford-educated expert in Semitic languages. Dr. Finch adjusted his glasses and pointed to the very clause Alara had used to their advantage. "Her interpretation of the river that feeds 2 valleys is amateurish and incorrect," he declared. "The phrase actually implies that the partner with more resources, Thorn Industries, is expected to bear the full burden of any loss. She has it completely backwards. She has nearly cost you billions." The room descended into chaos. The Nakamoto team looked confused and betrayed. Julian's board members, patched in via video call, were panicking. All eyes turned to Julian, then to Alara. Her moment of triumph had turned into a public crucifixion. Her past, the life of poverty and sacrifice she had fought so hard to escape, was being used as a weapon to destroy her. The pressure on Julian was immense. Board members were screaming in his ear through his discreet earpiece. "Cut her loose, Julian! Now! Disavow her, call it a mistake! Save the deal!" David Chen, his face pale, leaned in close. "Julian, listen to them. He has her dead to rights. Her credentials. They're nothing. We have to mitigate the damage." The world seemed to shrink around Julian, the cacophony of panicked voices fading into a dull roar. He looked past the shouting faces, past the damning evidence on the screen, and he looked at Alara. She was standing perfectly still amidst the hurricane, her expression not one of guilt or fear, but of profound, wounded disappointment. He saw the quiet integrity that had been her hallmark from the moment she'd first spoken in the diner. He saw the woman who had spent her life in the shadows, not because she was a fraud, but because the world had never bothered to look for her light. He had built his empire on calculated risks, but this was something else. This was a leap of faith. He muted his earpiece, silencing the chorus of doubt. He stood up and walked to stand beside Alara, a silent, unshakable declaration of solidarity. "I trust her," he said, his voice cutting through the noise with absolute authority. He turned to Marcus. "You have brought an expert, let's hear from ours." All eyes fell on Alara. This was her final test. The timid waitress was gone. In her place stood a scholar, her voice ringing with the quiet power of truth. "Dr. Finch is correct," she began, stunning the room into silence. "In the modern academic context, my interpretation could be seen as unconventional." She walked toward the screen. "However, Dr. Finch's expertise is in textual analysis, not living culture. The Nakamoto family's dialect of Aramaic is not a dead language learned from a book, it is a tradition passed down through generations. What he fails to understand is the honorific modifier attached to the word river. It's a nuance specific to their region, signifying that the river is not a passive object, but an active, giving force. My father, who was a cultural historian, documented this very thing. The phrase doesn't mean the larger entity gives more, it means the wiser entity, the one that sees the course of the river, is rewarded for its vision." She then turned to Dr. Finch. "A true expert would know this. Unless, of course, you weren't hired for your expertise, but for your willingness to present a specific, misleading opinion." Under her calm, analytical gaze, Dr. Finch began to sweat. His academic bluster crumbled. As her final, devastating move, Alara pointed to a section of the contract that everyone, including Marcus, had dismissed as boilerplate. "And finally," she said, her voice dropping, "there is the covenant of the pure spring and integrity clause. It states that any attempt by one party to deliberately mislead the other using deceptive interpretations of the text results in an immediate forfeiture of 10% of their company's shares to the wrong party. Not the company, Mr. Vance. The individual board member who orchestrates the deception." Marcus Vance went white as a sheet. He had been so focused on his trap that he had walked right into a much larger one. He was ruined. The Nakamoto patriarch stood up, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. He bowed his head slightly to Alara. The deal was saved. Her vindication was absolute. The flight back was quiet. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a shared sense of exhaustion and profound change. Alara stood by the panoramic window of Julian's penthouse apartment, the city lights spread out below her like a carpet of fallen stars. It was a world away from the flickering bulb in her tiny apartment, a universe away from the woman she had been just a few days ago. Julian came to stand beside her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. The Ice King was gone, replaced by a man who looked at her with an unguarded sincerity that made her heart ache. "Marcus has been removed from the board," he said softly. "His shares were absorbed. The covenant of the pure spring was quite clear." There was a comfortable silence, filled only by the distant hum of the city. He was holding a document, another leather-bound folder. Her heart sank for a moment, thinking it was a check, a final payment, the end of their brief, strange journey. "This is for you," he said, holding it out to her. She took it hesitantly. It wasn't a check. It was a contract. She read the title. Employment Agreement, Alara Vance, Head of Global Cultural Strategy and Special Projects. Below it was a salary figure with so many zeros she had to read it 3 times. It included a signing bonus that was double what he had initially promised her. It was not a thank you. It was not a reward. It was a recognition of her inherent, undeniable worth. It was a permanent place in his world, a department built around her unique gift. "I don't just want your talent for one deal, Alara," Julian said, his voice earnest. "I want your perspective in every room I walk into. Thorn Industries doesn't need another ruthless executive. It needs a soul. It needs your understanding." She looked up from the contract, her eyes shining with unshed tears. This was more than a job offer. It was him seeing her, all of her, the waitress, the scholar, the daughter, the survivor. The romantic tension that had been a silent undercurrent between them finally surfaced, no longer held back by their disparate worlds. "Why?" she whispered. "Why take such a risk on me?" He took a step closer, his gaze intense. "Because in that diner, when everyone else, including me, saw a waitress, you saw the truth. You reminded me that value isn't about the suit you wear or the title you hold. It's about what you carry inside. You're the most valuable person I've ever met." He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. It was a simple gesture, but it held all the promise of a new beginning. She had walked into his life to translate a contract, but she had ended up translating his world. And in the process, she had finally found her own. "So, let me ask you again. What is the hidden gift you carry? What treasure lies dormant within you, waiting for the right moment, or the right person, to see its true worth? We all wear uniforms of one kind or another. But beneath them, we are libraries of unique experiences, holders of secret knowledge." Share this story if you believe in the power of unseen potential. And tell us in the comments below, what is the one skill you have that the world might be surprised to learn? Because you are not invisible. You are just waiting to be read.